This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform where entrepreneurs can easily create and customize their own personal or professional website. More on Squarespace later in the video.
So hi and welcome to Geographics. I'm your interim host, Karl Smallwood, and today we're talking about the British Museum, the controversial repository of human history. Original article by Ben Adelman. Education advocate Horace Mann once said that every addition to true knowledge is an addition to human power. Few institutions are more dedicated to this maxim than the British Museum. Located in central London, the British Museum is one of the largest and most visited museums in the world, with a collection of some 8 million objects that span the entirety of human history, and some dating even before that. When it first opened in 1759, the British Museum represented what was at the time a radical concept, a free public museum that was open to everyone because it belonged not just to a person, but to the nation itself. And this is something I get confused about. American museums charge for entry. I was baffled when I went to the Field Museum of Chicago, for example. I want to see a dinosaur, and it's like $30 to get in. It's like, but it's history. Why are you paywalling history? Anyway, at a time when London was quickly becoming the centre of the world. This wasn't written by me, it was written by an American, I think. The British Museum was the place where you could experience the rest of the world without leaving the city, as its collection expanded to include cultural objects from all over the globe. This is going to be an uncomfortable one. Despite its noble ambitions, however, in many ways the British Museum became a shrine glorifying the success and power of the British Empire, which in the 19th century was one of the largest and most powerful in the history of the world. Many of the objects contained within the museum were seized by force from British colonies, often at the point of a gun. And much like the country itself, the museum has been struggling with its dark past in recent decades. This is the story of the British Museum, which, like the objects it collects and displays, has an interesting history of its own. The British Museum has its origins in the many private collections of curiosities that were acquired and displayed by European gentry, both as a hobby and as a demonstration of their wealth and influence. A gentleman's, and I quote, cabinet of curiosities was likely to include exotic items from foreign cultures, specimens of animals or plants, as well as artwork and antiquities. One of the largest collections of this type was assembled by Sir Hans Sloane, one of London's preeminent physicians. Sloane used his immense wealth gained from a variety of business interests to assemble a huge collection of objects from around the world. Dried plant specimens, seeds and insects from the Americas, medals and trinkets from the Middle East, pottery and surgical instruments from China, and coins and precious stones from all parts in between. When Sloane died in 1753 at age 92, it's not bad. Well done, Sloane. His executors counted nearly 80,000 separate objects in his collection, plus an astounding 50,000 books in his library. Speculators put the value of his collection as high as £200,000, a massive sum in an era when the average family lived on £20 to £30 in income per year. Sloane had no male heirs and outlived his own wife by decades, so the question of what to do with all of his stuff was a perplexing one to say the least. Sloane himself worried that his collection will be broken up after his death and sold at auction piecemeal, the way he'd done with other collections while he was alive, mind you, specified in his will that he wanted the British nation to buy his collection for the sum of £20,000 and display it all in a museum that would be open to the public. The idea of a public national museum was an odd one in the 18th century. Most collections of this type were personal property of monarchs, noblemen, or the church, who might temporarily put them on display, but it was entirely at their own discretion. Pretty much the only example then in existence was the collection of Greek and Roman antiquities in the Capitoline Museum in Rome, which opened in 1734 by Pope Clement XII. There was a legitimate concern among the ruling class that the rabble, that's me and the rabble, might just steal everything out of a public museum, or that increased knowledge about the world around them might spark revolution. Still, the British Museum Act of 1753 passed through Parliament and was given royal assent, primarily based on the threat in Sloane's will if they refused, the collection would be offered in turn to another great court of Europe. The idea of Britain's greatest private collection of treasures and antiquities ending up in the hands of Russia, or, heavens forbid, France, was unthinkable after all, making it even more controversial. The initial funding for the museum came from a government-run lottery, where gamblers could buy tickets for prizes ranging as high as £10,000. The lottery was a scandalous affair among the upper echelons of British society, who were outspoken opponents of gambling, at least in public. The British Museum opened in 1759 in Montague House, a converted 17th century mansion located in the Bloomsbury district of London. Admission was free, but in an attempt to keep out the riff-raff, that's me again, You were required to write to the museum to reserve tickets for a tour, a practice that continued until 1806. In an effort to prevent the objects from being damaged or stolen, all the objects were secured within drawers, cabinets, or on shelves, and unlike the private collector tours of the era, no touching of the objects was allowed.
Sorry to interrupt everybody, but I am here to talk about today's sponsor, Karl. Okay, so how would you like your own website? Websites are cool, they're basically a necessity these days if you want to get your name or business out there. Well, today's sponsor, Squarespace, is great for newcomers and oldcomers? Is that a word? One of the biggest hurdles when creating a website is actually creating the website. Squarespace knows this, so they've made it as easy as possible. Even Karl could do it. You can pick from one of their many templates, or if you fancy yourself a bit of a design whiz, you can try out their Fluid engine. You can just pick what you want to add, drop it into place, and change it however you like. Doing an ad is thirsty work. You got anything to drink? Hey, he's got a mini fridge under here. Cheers. You can also use Squarespace to build up a mailing list and keep everyone updated all at once with an email campaign. Been working on something big? Send an email out. Got a new product or offer? Send an email out. Snacks! You can keep track of your emails and more with the analytics page. Keep an eye on the numbers and change things based on what does well and what doesn't. What? Head on down to squarespace.com/geographics and use the promo code Geographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Should probably let him get back to it, shouldn't I?
Although called the British Museum, the objects displayed primarily consisted of Sloane's collection, as well as a few other collections acquired at the same time. This began to change in the following decades as more collections of objects were acquired or donated to the museum. These included a display of objects acquired from the South Sea voyages of Captain James Cook, Greek and Roman artefacts collected by Sir William Hamilton, British ambassador to Naples, and Egyptian antiquities seized from the French following the Battle of the Nile in 1798. Including the Rosetta Stone, a priceless stone slab created in 196 BC. The stone was a decree issued by Pharaoh Ptolemy V, with the same message etched into it in 3 languages, including ancient Greek and Egyptian hieroglyphics. The French linguist Jean-François Champollion would later use the Rosetta Stone to fully translate the ancient Egyptian language for the first time in 1400 years. As the collections of the British Museum grew, it soon became clear that Montague House was neither large nor grand enough for its intended purpose. It would be demolished in 1840 to make way for the massive new building constructed to replace it, which opened in 1857, following decades of construction. The new building, designed by one Sir Robert Smirke, is considered a seminal example of neoclassical architecture that was popular for civic buildings of the period, an ancient Greek-inspired design based on the Parthenon in Athens. For the first time, instead of relying on assembled collections of others, the British Museum now began to sponsor excavation projects at ancient sites around the world in hopes of finding new and interesting objects to display. One famous example is the work done by museum archaeologist Sir Charles Newton, who in 1857 discovered the remains of the mausoleum of... Deep breath, Karl, you can do this. Halicarnassus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and brought statues and other artwork that decorated the ancient tombs to the museum, where they are still displayed today. Proud, and it doesn't. That's even ironically, I don't want to say that. One casualty of the explosive growth of the museum was the man that started it all in the first place, Hans Sloane. His objects assumed less and less importance as time went on. And when the plant and animal specimens were spun off into a new natural history museum in 1887, Sloane's worst fears were realised and his collection was ultimately broken up. Few of his objects are still on display today, replaced with more exciting historical finds. With the creation of the Natural History Museum, the National Gallery, which contains artwork, the British Library, where thousands of books were moved in 1997, and the focus of the British Museum shifted from collecting everything to focusing exclusively on the history of humanity, spanning from the Paleolithic era to the present. The museum continued to expand into the 20th century, though, like most everything else in European society, it was disrupted by the outbreak of World War II in 1939. On the advice of the Home Secretary, the museum's collections were crated up and stored in secure underground locations for the duration of the conflict. And this was a good thing too, because the British Museum's building was heavily damaged by German bombs during the Blitz, requiring extensive reconstruction work after the war ended. The present look of the British Museum took shape in 1997 when the centre of the museum, which had previously housed the library, was redesigned into the Queen Elizabeth II Great Court. Described as the largest covered square in Europe, the Great Court serves as the focal point and lobby for the museum, much in the same way the Louvre. I've heard French people pronounce it like the Louvre or the Louvre. So I'm just going to say the Louvre Glass Pyramid does in Paris. That's right. I studied French for a little bit. Today, the British Museum has around 80,000 objects on display at any one time. Within the museum's 94 rooms, called galleries, the museum is divided into 8 different departments, including ones focused on ancient Egypt, as well as ancient Greece and Rome, which are among the most popular. The museum is one of the largest of its kind in the world, covering an area of over 92,000 square metres, and a visit on a walking tour will cover more than 2 miles in order to see everything on display. Only around 1% of the museum's more than 8 million objects in its collection are on display. The rest are kept in a nearly 30,000 square metre storage space, most of which is in the museum's basement. Just the idea is like human history just stored in a big crate in a basement. Like, we all thought Indiana Jones was unrealistic, but here we are. In 2019, the last year attendance figures before the global disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic are available, the museum had more than 6 million visitors, over half of which were foreign tourists, making it the third most visited museum in the world, behind only the Louvre and the Vatican museums in Rome. Like many other attractions around the world, the museum was significantly impacted by the pandemic, being closed for most of 2020 into 2021, resulting in a significant decline in attendance that they still haven't completely recovered from. Just like when it first opened in 1759, admission to the British Museum is free to the public. This tradition has extended to the UK's other national museums, with their funding instead coming from the government as well as private fundraising and endowment programmes. If you can't make it to London to see the exhibits in person, not to worry. The museum has one of the largest online presences of any museum in the world, with pictures and descriptions of over 4 million objects in its collection. The museum has also done a lot to garner interest in its content through the video game Minecraft, providing a brick-by-brick reproduction of the museum and its exhibits built within the game starting in 2014. That's incredible. As much as the British Museum projects a progressive, forward-thinking vision today, it has unfortunately been grappling with a controversial history that stretches all the way back to its very founding. The keystone of Hans Sloane's fortune that he used to build his massive collection of curiosity that formed the nucleus of the modern museum was from the wealth gained when he married the widow of a Jamaican sugar plantation owner. Sloane in fact had controlling interest in several plantations on the British-controlled island, each of which were worked by dozens, if not hundreds, of African slaves imported and sold as part of the triangular trade. Indeed, objects taken from slaves formed a not significant part of his collection, much of which was obtained during a 15-month stint in Jamaica, serving as a governor's personal physician. Sloane collected everything he found curious, and that included human body parts, many of which were taken directly from slaves, including one macabre example of a stillborn fetus preserved in a jar of alcohol. He stole my just every day. The thing is, most people watching this are American, according to our demographics. You know what it's like, right? This is your everyday too. As the British Empire grew to become one of the most powerful in the history of the world, the British Museum also expanded, taking in many new objects from places in the Americas, Africa and Asia that the British established colonies in. While many of these were obtained honestly through trade or purchase, many were taken by force, such as the story of the Benin bronzes. In 1897, the British attacked and destroyed the Kingdom of Benin in modern-day Nigeria, supposedly in retaliation for an attack on a British survey party. They sacked Benin City and burned it to the ground, including the palace of the Oba, or king. They also seized a great deal of artwork and other treasures as war loot, including the Benin bronzes, a collection of over 1,000 metal sculptures and plaques depicting the cultural history of the Benin people, many of which were centuries old. Around 40% of the bronzes ended up in the British Museum, with the rest being sold at auction and being placed in other museums and private collections across Europe. And there's a really harrowing like John Oliver bit where like the current like descendant of that king has to go to the British Museum to see his own history. It's not great. Another collection. Oh, there's more. Okay, great, thanks. In the museum with a controversial ownership history is the so-called Elgin marbles. In 1801, Lord Elgin, the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, commissioned workers to make plaster casts and drawings of the surviving sculptures of the Parthenon in Athens, most of which date to 5th century BC. Acting on his own initiative, Elgin decided that he needed to save the marble artwork from being destroyed by the ruling Turks by removing them and having them shipped to Britain. Over the course of a decade, Elgin's agents removed about half of the remaining marbles, often using crude method that caused irreparable damage to the Parthenon itself. The acquisition of the marbles was controversial even at the time, with many people, including the poet Lord Byron, being harshly critical of the action. However, in 1816, an inquiry by Parliament found that Elgin had acquired the marble legally, after he produced an edict from Turkish authorities that gave him permission to take them. However, no copy of this paperwork has ever been located within the Ottoman archives, making it impossible to determine if Elgin's actions were actually legal or not. No, they weren't. In any case, the marbles were bought by the government and were placed in the care of the British Museum. Both the Benin bronzes and the Elgin marbles are still on display in the museum, despite many, many years of quite reasonable protest from the Nigerian and Greek governments. The Greeks even went as far as to deliberately set aside space in the Acropolis Museum when it opened in 2009, denoting where the pieces and sculptures and artwork should be instead of in London. You know what? I respect that. That's the level of pettiness I respect. Good on you, Greece. It's important to note here that the British Museum is not the only offender when it comes to acquiring artwork under less than savoury circumstances. Museums all around the world, but particularly in Europe and North America, are filled with pieces of culture taken by force or trickery from somewhere else. Napoleon, for example, seized artwork from everywhere he campaigned, with many pieces, particularly from Italy and Egypt, still in museums like the Louvre. The Nazis went on what has been called the biggest art theft in world history, as Hitler planned to display all of his captures in a gigantic museum in Linz. That never came to fruition for obvious reasons. He died and the Nazis lost. In turn, the Soviet Union sent out prize patrols when they invaded Germany in 1945, seizing many artifacts that they claimed as compensation for war crimes committed against them. Most are still in Russia to this day. The worst affected area of the globe for this is Africa. One study commissioned by the French government found that between 90 to 95% of the cultural heritage of the African continent is being held or displayed in museums or collections outside of Africa. Most of it acquired during the 19th century scramble for Africa, when virtually the entire continent was carved up into colonies by various European countries. The British Museum has been the focal point of criticism, not only because it's one of the largest and most visited in the world, but because of their outspoken opposition to the return of any of the contested items in their collection. They point to the British Museum Act of 1963, a law which forbids the museum from selling or giving away anything in the collection except under certain very specific circumstances. And for the moment, Parliament seems unwilling to make any changes to the law, with Prime Minister David Cameron claiming in 2010 that if you say yes to one, you suddenly find the British Museum would be empty. Yeah. That's the point, David! For anyone curious, this was in response to a question asked about the Indian Kohinoor diamond, currently part of the crown jewels. This slippery slope argument, if you began returning certain contested objects to their country of origin, you will eventually have to return everything else in the collection, has remained a point of concern for the government ministers, with Cultural Secretary Michelle Donnellan remarking that it would be a very dangerous and slippery road to embark down when commenting on negotiations between the British and Greek governments regarding the Elgin marbles in December 2022. Just getting the stuff back, man. We've already got British culture. Actually, we've got fish and chips. And they may well have a point, since the Benin bronzes and Elgin marbles are far from the only items in the British Museum's collection that have been the subject of petitions for return. The list of contested objects includes, but is not limited to, the Rosetta Stone, Egypt, statues taken from Easter Island, Chile, and a collection of objects seized as loot during a military campaign in Ethiopia in 1868. There's also been controversy about the more than 6,000 human remains in the museum's collection, as questions have been asked of museums in general whether it's appropriate to put human corpses on display, including Egyptian mummies as well as remains from indigenous Australians which were taken from graves and displayed to the British public for decades in the 19th and 20th centuries. As an idea of how widespread this is, I currently live in Sheffield, a small city by American standards in Britain. Our museum has mummies in it. We stole a lot of mummies. The question, what do we do now when it comes to cultural objects taken forcibly from the global south and placed in Western museums, is not an easy one to answer. and it is likely one that will vex curators and directors of those museums, including the British ones, for the foreseeable future. Some museums have responded to pressure by returning contested objects to their countries of origin, including several Benin bronzes, but the British Museum has held firm, causing many to criticise it, claiming that it is at best out of touch with modern society and at worst a monument to British imperialism, with those items displayed not commemorating the cultures that made them, but the colonial powers that took them. Regardless of the controversy that surrounds it, the British Museum seems to have suffered no major loss in popularity. Over 4 million visitors came to see exhibits in 2022, which, while still much less than the pre-pandemic numbers, is in line with other attractions as the recovery from the COVID-19 shutdown continues. One area of concern for the museum is that tourism from other European countries might decline in the wake of the UK's exit from the European Union. That is yet to be determined. That happened 10 years ago. I think the day Brexit happened, I was in Switzerland, enjoying the European Union. I remember I went inside a Swiss hostel and they asked, can you have some money as a deposit for your key? And I offered them £10 I had in my pocket. I'm like, can't accept that. So why? I went Brexit. It turns out that was what's called Swiss humour. And I was very, very relieved that they would. But Britain. The museum has a number of projects it's currently working on, including a joint effort with the Natural History Museum and the British Library that is attempting to bring together all of the surviving items from Hans Sloane's original collection in order to hold a proper exhibition honouring the founder of the British Museum. There are also future exhibits planned on artwork from 19th century China, as well as the ancient Achaemenid Persian Empire, among others. Overall, the British Museum has the same goal it had in its first founder: to educate and inform the public about the world around them, particularly their past. What has changed, though, is who we as a society continue worthy of that knowledge. We've come a long way from the 18th century, when pregnant women were instructed to avert their eyes at certain museum exhibits lest their imaginations caused the baby inside them to come out deformed. The question that everyone who visits the British Museum, and especially those responsible for directing it, should be asking themselves is whether or not continuing to possess and display objects taken from other cultures without permission is something that we should continue to condone. After all, the objects in question may be nothing more than pieces of art or symbol trinkets to us, but to the people that made them and their descendants, they are an important part of their cultural history, their civilization. So cheers to everyone for tuning in. Once again, I'm your host, Karl Small, for this episode of Geographics, and that video was based on an article written by one Ben Adelman, links to which you can find below, no doubt. If anyone curious, who the hell are you? I'm Karl Smallwood. I used to write for Top 10s, the sister site to Geographics, many years ago, and I'm stepping in as the interim host, thanks to my experience running my own channel, Fact Fiend with Karl Small, which you can probably, again, find below. If you enjoyed this video, why not like, comment and subscribe? And as always, have the day you deserve.